Sarah Mitchell had always believed that hard work would eventually pay off. She'd been working as an executive assistant at Morrison & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious marketing firms, for 3 years. Every morning, she arrived at the sleek downtown office building before anyone else, coffee brewing and agenda prepared. The winter wind off Lake Michigan cut through her wool coat as she hurried across the marble lobby, but she never complained. This job was her stepping stone to something bigger. Her boss, David Morrison, was the kind of man who commanded attention when he walked into a room. Tall, well-dressed, and undeniably charismatic, he had built his company from the ground up. Sarah respected his business acumen, even if his personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. For the past 6 months, David had been seeing Melissa Crawford, a stunning blonde real estate agent who seemed to view the office as her personal playground. Before we continue with Sarah's incredible journey of determination and ultimate triumph, I want to tell you about an amazing opportunity we're offering to our viewers. We're giving away a brand new motorcycle to celebrate our growing community. All you need to do is subscribe to our channel, give this video a thumbs up, and comment below letting us know which city or country you're watching from. The winner will be announced next month, so don't miss your chance to ride away with this incredible prize. Sarah had grown up in a modest household in suburban Milwaukee, where her parents had instilled in her the values of hard work and perseverance. Her father was a factory supervisor, her mother a school secretary, and they had always told their daughter that education and dedication were the keys to a better life. When Sarah graduated from the University of Wisconsin with a degree in business administration, she had dreams of climbing the corporate ladder and eventually running her own company. Those dreams had felt more distant lately. 3 years of organizing schedules, managing correspondence, and coordinating meetings had begun to feel less like a stepping stone and more like a permanent destination. But Sarah had convinced herself that she was learning valuable skills, that she was positioning herself for advancement. She told herself that patience was a virtue and that her time would come. The Morrison & Associates office occupied 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in the heart of Chicago's Loop District. The company specialized in high-end marketing campaigns for Fortune 500 companies, and their client list read like a who's who of American business. Sarah's desk sat outside David's corner office, perfectly positioned to intercept visitors and manage his incredibly demanding schedule. She had learned to anticipate his needs with almost supernatural precision. She knew that he preferred his coffee black with a single sugar cube, that he needed exactly 15 minutes between meetings to decompress, and that he became irritable when his shirts weren't pressed to his exact specifications. These weren't just professional observations. They were survival skills in an environment where attention to detail meant the difference between success and failure. Melissa's heels clicked against the polished floors as she sauntered through the office that Tuesday afternoon in March. The spring sunshine streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to follow her wherever she went. She had that effortless beauty that made other women feel invisible, and she knew it. Her designer handbag cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, and her confidence was equally expensive. Melissa Crawford came from the kind of Chicago family that appeared in society pages and donated wings to hospitals. Her father was a prominent surgeon, her mother served on the boards of several prestigious charities, and Melissa herself had attended Northwestern University on what she liked to call a social scholarship, meaning her parents had made substantial donations to secure her admission. She had never worked a day in her life before becoming a real estate agent, and even that was more of a hobby than a necessity. Sarah was organizing David's calendar when Melissa approached her desk. The scent of her perfume was overwhelming, a heavy floral fragrance that seemed designed to announce her presence before she even spoke. Sarah looked up from her computer screen, offering a professional smile that she'd perfected over years of customer service. "Is David available?" Melissa asked, though she was already heading toward his corner office. Her tone suggested that his availability was merely a formality. "He's on a conference call with the Peterson account," Sarah replied diplomatically. "It should be wrapping up in about 15 minutes. Would you like me to let him know you're here?" The Peterson account was one of Morrison & Associates' largest clients, a multinational corporation that generated nearly 30% of the company's annual revenue. Sarah had spent weeks preparing materials for this particular call, researching market trends and competitor analysis that would inform their upcoming campaign strategy. She knew every detail of the presentation, every potential objection the client might raise, and every backup plan David would need if the conversation went south. Melissa turned back, her blue eyes scanning Sarah from head to toe with the kind of assessment that wealthy women often gave to service workers. There was something predatory in that gaze, something that made Sarah's stomach tighten with unease. "You know," Melissa said, perching herself on the edge of Sarah's desk without invitation, "I've been thinking about you lately." Sarah's fingers paused over her keyboard. In her experience, when someone like Melissa claimed to be thinking about her, it was never for positive reasons. The office around them continued its normal rhythm, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the low murmur of conversations, but Sarah felt as though she and Melissa were suddenly isolated in their own bubble of tension. "I'm sorry," Sarah asked, genuinely confused by the direction of the conversation. Melissa's laugh was like crystal breaking, sharp and beautiful and somehow dangerous. "It's just that you've been working here for, 3 years now? And you're still just David's assistant. Don't you think that's a little sad?" The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been asking herself the same question lately, but hearing it from Melissa's perfectly glossed lips made it sting in a way she hadn't expected. Sarah straightened in her chair, drawing on every ounce of professionalism she possessed. "I enjoy my work here," she said carefully. "Mr. Morrison has been an excellent mentor." Sarah had always prided herself on her professionalism, even in difficult situations. She'd dealt with angry clients, demanding vendors, and impossible deadlines without losing her composure. But there was something about Melissa's casual cruelty that felt different, more personal, more designed to wound than to accomplish any practical purpose. "Oh, honey," Melissa's voice dripped with false sympathy. "You really don't see it, do you? You think this is all temporary, like you're building toward something bigger. But the truth is, you'll never be more than his assistant. Some people are just meant to serve others, and there's nothing wrong with that. You should probably just accept it and stop reaching for things that are beyond your grasp." The office noise seemed to fade completely now. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. Melissa's words weren't just cruel. They were calculated. This wasn't a casual observation. It was a deliberate attempt to put Sarah in what Melissa considered her proper place. Sarah had always been sensitive about her background, about the fact that she hadn't grown up with the advantages that many of her colleagues took for granted. She'd worked her way through college, lived on ramen noodles and scholarship money, and felt grateful for every opportunity that came her way. But Melissa's words suggested that gratitude might actually be holding her back, that she'd confused appreciation with acceptance of limitations. "I appreciate your concern," Sarah managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I think you might be surprised by what I'm capable of." Melissa slid off the desk, smoothing her silk blouse with practiced elegance. "Oh, sweet Sarah, I know exactly what you're capable of. You're capable of getting David's coffee exactly how he likes it. You're capable of scheduling his meetings and answering his phones. And you're very capable of staying exactly where you are for the rest of your career." The condescension in Melissa's voice was breathtaking in its casualness. She spoke as though Sarah's limitations were as obvious and immutable as the color of her eyes. There was no anger in her tone, no heat, just a cold certainty that was somehow more devastating than outright hostility would have been. With that, Melissa turned and walked toward David's office, her heels clicking a triumphant rhythm against the floor. Sarah watched her go, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was certainly that. It was more like a door slamming shut on one version of herself and another door swinging wide open. For the rest of the afternoon, Sarah found herself observing the office with new eyes. She watched as junior executives confidently presented ideas in conference rooms, noticed how account managers spoke with authority about client needs, observed the easy camaraderie between colleagues who saw themselves as equals rather than superiors and subordinates. She realized that somewhere along the way, she had started to see herself through other people's eyes rather than her own. She had accepted the role of supporter rather than leader, helper rather than innovator. But Melissa's cruel assessment had forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. She had been complicit in her own limitation. That evening, Sarah sat in her modest apartment in Lincoln Park, staring out at the city lights that twinkled like earthbound stars. Her laptop was open on the kitchen table, and she'd been scrolling through job listings for hours. But with each position she read, she found herself thinking not about what she wanted to do, but about what Melissa had said. The apartment itself reflected Sarah's careful approach to life. Everything was neat, organized, and modestly priced. She'd furnished it with pieces from discount stores and second-hand shops, creating a space that was comfortable but unambitious. Like her career, it was safe and practical and somehow smaller than what she actually needed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Emma, who lived in Portland and worked as a freelance graphic designer. How was work today? Still loving the big city corporate life. Emma had always been the adventurous one, the sister who quit stable jobs to travel or start new businesses. She'd backpacked through Europe, taught English in South Korea, and started 3 different companies before finding success with her design studio. Sarah had always admired Emma's courage while secretly believing that her own cautious approach was more responsible. Sarah found herself typing and deleting several responses. How could she explain that her day had been simultaneously routine and life-changing? That a conversation lasting less than 5 minutes had forced her to confront truths about herself that she'd been avoiding for months? Finally, she settled on, "Had an interesting conversation today. Might be time for some changes." Emma's response came quickly, "Good. You've been too comfortable for too long. Sometimes you need someone to push you out of the nest." Sarah smiled despite herself. Emma had been telling her for years that she was undervaluing herself, that she had more potential than she was willing to acknowledge. But Sarah had always responded with practical concerns about job security and career stability. Now she wondered if her sister had been seeing something that she herself had been blind to. She spent the evening researching Morrison and Associates competitors, studying their organizational structures and career advancement paths. She read industry publications, analyzed market trends, and began to understand the broader context of the work she'd been supporting for 3 years. What she discovered was both exciting and sobering. She knew far more about the business than she'd realized, but she'd been content to apply that knowledge in service of others rather than in pursuit of her own advancement. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began to pay attention to things she'd previously ignored. She noticed how often David relied on her judgment, how frequently clients called her directly instead of going through official channels. She realized that she knew more about the day-to-day operations of Morrison and Associates than anyone except David himself. She also began to notice the subtle dynamics that had kept her in her current role. David, despite his respect for her work, had never seriously considered promoting her beyond administrative positions. Her colleagues, while friendly, had never invited her to participate in strategic discussions or creative brainstorming sessions. She had been categorized as support staff and had unconsciously accepted that categorization. But most importantly, she noticed that David seemed increasingly stressed. His usually impeccable appearance was showing signs of strain, ties slightly askew, hair not quite as perfectly styled. He was staying later at the office, taking more calls behind closed doors, and his easy confidence seemed to be fraying at the edges. Sarah had always been attuned to David's moods and needs, but now she began to analyze them with a more strategic eye. She observed that his stress seemed to correlate with specific accounts and business challenges, and she started to form opinions about potential solutions. For the first time in her career, she began to think like a business strategist rather than an administrative assistant. Melissa, meanwhile, continued to treat the office as her personal domain. She would arrive unannounced, interrupt meetings, and expect everyone to accommodate her schedule. Sarah watched as the other employees grew increasingly uncomfortable with her presence, though no one dared to complain directly. During one particularly awkward incident, Melissa had arrived during a client presentation and insisted on being introduced to the potential clients. She'd spent 20 minutes discussing her real estate business while David and his team waited politely for her to finish. After she left, Sarah had seen the frustrated expressions on her colleagues' faces, but everyone had simply pretended the interruption hadn't happened. Sarah began to understand that Melissa's behavior wasn't just personally irritating. It was professionally damaging. But more than that, she began to see how Melissa's need to diminish others was actually a reflection of her own insecurities and limitations. The realization was both liberating and empowering. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in April. Sarah was working late, finishing a presentation that David needed for an early morning client meeting. The presentation was for Hartwell Industries, a potential client that could significantly expand Morrison & Associates' presence in the healthcare sector. Sarah had spent weeks researching Hartwell's business model, their competitive challenges, and their target demographics. She'd identified opportunities that David hadn't considered and developed creative approaches that could differentiate Morrison & Associates from the competition. The work was far beyond what was typically expected of an assistant, but Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to the strategic aspects of the business. The office was quiet, most of the staff having left hours earlier. She was alone with her computer and the sound of rain drumming against the windows when she heard raised voices from David's office. "I can't keep doing this, Melissa." David's voice carried clearly across the empty office. "The pressure is killing me. The board is asking questions I can't answer, and I'm starting to make mistakes I can't afford." Sarah had known that Morrison & Associates was facing some financial pressures, but she hadn't realized how serious the situation had become. The company had been pursuing aggressive expansion, opening new offices and hiring additional staff based on projected revenue that hadn't materialized as quickly as expected. "Then maybe you need to be stronger." Melissa's voice was sharp, cutting through the night air like a blade. "Winners don't make excuses, David. They find solutions. It's not that simple. The Henderson account is threatening to pull out, and if they do, we lose 20% of our revenue. I'm trying to hold everything together, but I feel like I'm drowning." The Henderson account was indeed crucial to the company's financial stability. Sarah knew every detail of their contract, every point of potential friction, every aspect of the relationship that could be improved or strengthened. She'd been managing the day-to-day communications with Henderson for months, and she'd noticed signs of dissatisfaction that David hadn't had time to address. There was a long pause, and Sarah found herself holding her breath, straining to hear Melissa's response. "Maybe," Melissa said finally, "you're just not cut out for this level of responsibility. Some people reach their ceiling, David. There's no shame in admitting that." Sarah's blood ran cold. The casual cruelty in Melissa's voice was identical to what she'd heard in their previous conversation. This wasn't support. It was sabotage disguised as honesty. "What are you saying?" David's voice was quieter now, uncertain. "I'm saying that maybe it's time to consider your options. Step back, let someone else handle the pressure. You could sell the company, take the money, and we could travel. See the world. Wouldn't that be better than slowly destroying yourself trying to be something you're not?" Sarah couldn't listen anymore. She quietly saved her work, gathered her things, and slipped out of the office. But as she waited for the elevator, her mind was racing. David wasn't failing because he lacked ability. He was failing because he was being systematically undermined by someone who was supposed to support him. The realization crystallized something that had been building in Sarah's mind for weeks. Melissa's approach to relationships wasn't just personally toxic. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain control by keeping others feeling inadequate and dependent. She had tried the same approach with Sarah, and now she was applying it to David. But more than that, Sarah realized she had been accepting a similar dynamic in her professional life. She had allowed herself to be defined by limitations rather than possibilities, and she had been complicit in maintaining a status quo that served everyone except herself. The next morning, Sarah arrived early as usual, but this time she had a plan. She'd spent most of the night researching, thinking, and preparing. When David arrived, looking more haggard than she'd ever seen him, she was ready. "Mr. Morrison," she said, standing as he approached his office. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" He paused, his hand on his office door. The strain was evident in every line of his face, in the way he carried his shoulders, in the distracted quality of his gaze. "Sarah, I'm really not in the mood for scheduling discussions right now. Can it wait?" "It's about the Henderson account," she said quietly. "I think I might have a solution." David's expression shifted immediately. He opened his office door and gestured for her to follow him inside. The morning light streaming through his windows revealed the full extent of his exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes, deeper lines around his mouth, a general air of defeat that she'd never seen in him before. His office, usually a model of organized efficiency, showed signs of recent chaos. Papers were scattered across his desk, coffee cups sat forgotten on various surfaces, and the typically pristine environment reflected the stress that had been consuming him. "Talk to me," he said, sinking into his chair. Sarah had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was her chance to prove that Melissa had been wrong, that she was capable of far more than anyone had given her credit for. "I've been monitoring the Henderson situation closely," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Their primary concern isn't actually about our campaign strategy. It's about timing. They're worried about launching their new product line during the economic uncertainty, and they think our timeline is too aggressive." David leaned forward, his attention now fully focused on her words. Sarah could see the shift in his demeanor, the way his professional instincts engaged despite his exhaustion. "But here's the thing," Sarah continued, pulling out the folder she'd prepared. "I ran some analysis on their target demographic and compared it to similar launches during economic downturns over the past decade. Companies that launched during uncertain times actually saw stronger brand loyalty and market penetration, because their competitors were holding back." She spread the charts and graphs across his desk, pointing to specific data points as she spoke. The research represented weeks of work that she'd done in her spare time, driven by a growing understanding of the business that went far beyond her official responsibilities. "If we can reframe the narrative from risky launch during uncertainty to bold market positioning when competitors are hesitant, we turn their biggest concern into their biggest advantage," Sarah continued. "The key is to position Henderson not as a company taking a risk, but as a market leader seizing an opportunity." David studied the materials she'd prepared, his expression growing more animated with each page. Sarah could see his natural strategic mind engaging with her analysis, could watch as his confidence began to return. "Sarah, this is brilliant. How long did this take you to put together?" "Most of the night," she admitted. "But I've been thinking about it for weeks. I know their business almost as well as you do at this point." He looked up at her with an expression she'd never seen before, not just respect, but genuine appreciation for her capabilities. It was the look he gave to colleagues and collaborators, not subordinates. "Why didn't you tell me you'd been working on this?" Sarah felt a flush of confidence that was entirely new to her. "Because until recently, I didn't think it was my place. But I'm starting to realize that maybe it's time for me to expand my role here." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them had explicitly acknowledged before. Sarah had just declared her intention to move beyond the boundaries of her current position, and David was clearly recognizing that she had already been operating beyond those boundaries for some time. Over the next several hours, they worked together to refine Sarah's proposal. David's energy returned as they developed the strategy, his natural charisma reasserting itself as he saw a path forward. Sarah found herself contributing ideas and insights that David built upon, creating a collaborative dynamic that felt entirely different from their usual employer-employee relationship. The process revealed to both of them how much Sarah had been underutilized in her current role. Her understanding of the client's needs, her grasp of market dynamics, and her ability to synthesize complex information into actionable strategies were all far more developed than anyone had realized. By lunchtime, they had a complete presentation that reframed the Henderson account not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to be seized. The strategy they developed was bold, innovative, and perfectly tailored to Henderson's specific concerns and ambitions. The presentation to Henderson Industries that afternoon was a triumph. Sarah sat beside David in the conference room, watching as the client's expressions shifted from skepticism to interest to genuine excitement. She found herself answering technical questions and providing detailed explanations that demonstrated her deep understanding of their business. The Henderson executives were impressed not just with the strategy, but with the level of research and insight that had gone into its development. When they learned that Sarah had been the primary architect of the analysis, they specifically requested that she be involved in the implementation phase. When they left the building 2 hours later with a signed contract extension and an increased budget, David was practically glowing. "Sarah," he said as they walked back toward their office building, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "For not recognizing your potential sooner. You've been capable of this level of work all along, haven't you? I just never gave you the opportunity to show it." The spring air felt different now, charged with possibility in a way that Sarah had never experienced before. The Chicago streets seemed more vibrant, the sounds of the city more energetic, as though the world itself was responding to her newfound sense of purpose. "I think we were both comfortable with the status quo," she said diplomatically. "Well, that changes now. I want you to take the lead on the Henderson account going forward. Full project management authority, your own team, the works. And we need to talk about your title and compensation. Assistant doesn't begin to cover what you're actually doing here." That evening, Sarah was working late again, but this time it felt different. She wasn't staying late because she had to, but because she was genuinely excited about the projects she was developing. The office felt different too, not like a place where she was stuck, but like a launching pad for something bigger. She was developing implementation strategies for the Henderson campaign when she heard David's voice rising in his office. But this time, the conversation was different. "No, Melissa, I'm not interested in selling the company. We just landed the Henderson expansion, and Sarah has identified 3 other accounts with similar potential." "Sarah?" Melissa's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You're making business decisions based on your assistant's opinions now? She's not my assistant anymore. She's the new director of strategic development, and she's the reason this company is about to have its best quarter in 2 years. Sarah felt a surge of pride so strong it was almost overwhelming. Director of Strategic Development. She'd never even dared to dream that high. The title represented not just a promotion, but a fundamental shift in how she was perceived and valued. "David, you're being ridiculous. She's not qualified for that kind of responsibility. She's going to make mistakes that cost you everything you've built." "The only mistake I made was listening to people who told me to play it safe when I should have been taking calculated risks. Sarah understands this business and she understands what it takes to grow. That's more than I can say for some people." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Melissa becoming increasingly agitated and David remaining firm in his position. Sarah could hear the fundamental difference in his tone. He sounded confident again, decisive, like the leader she'd always known he could be. The silence that followed was pregnant with tension. Sarah could almost feel Melissa's fury radiating through the office walls. "Fine." Melissa's voice was ice-cold now. "But don't come crying to me when your little experiment fails, and you realize you should have stuck with people who actually belong in your world." Sarah heard the sound of heels clicking rapidly across the floor, then the elevator doors opening and closing. A few minutes later, David emerged from his office, looking both relieved and exhausted. "Sarah," he said, noticing her at her desk. "I thought you'd gone home hours ago." "Just finishing up the Morrison Industries presentation," she said. "Is everything all right?" David ran a hand through his hair, disturbing his usually perfect styling. "Actually, yes. For the first time in months, I think everything is going to be fine." He walked over to her desk and sat down in one of the chairs typically reserved for visitors. The casual gesture spoke volumes about how their relationship had evolved over the course of a single day. "I want you to know that what happened today wasn't just about the Henderson account. You've been contributing at this level for months, maybe years. I just wasn't paying attention. That's going to change." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with professional advancement and everything to do with being truly seen and valued for who she was rather than who others expected her to be. The following Monday, Sarah arrived at the office to find a nameplate on her new desk. Sarah Mitchell, Director of Strategic Development. The desk itself was in a corner office with windows overlooking the Chicago River. It wasn't as large as David's office, but it was hers, and the view was spectacular. The move from the assistant's desk outside David's office to her own space felt symbolic of everything that had changed in her life. She was no longer positioned to serve someone else's needs. She was positioned to pursue her own vision and objectives. Her first staff meeting as a director was scheduled for 10 o'clock. She'd spent the weekend preparing, researching best practices for team leadership, and developing her vision for the department. But as she sat in the conference room, looking at the faces of the 5 people who would now be reporting to her, she felt a momentary flutter of imposter syndrome. The team included 2 junior account executives, a research analyst, a creative coordinator, and a client relations specialist. Most of them had been her peers just days earlier, and she could see the curiosity and uncertainty in their expressions. Before we dive into the strategic planning, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves, I want to acknowledge that this is a significant transition for all of us. 6 months ago, I was David's assistant. Today, I'm your director. That doesn't mean I have all the answers, but it does mean that I'm committed to learning and growing alongside all of you. The response was immediate and positive. Her team members, most of whom had been her peers just days earlier, nodded with understanding and what looked like genuine respect. Now, Sarah continued, feeling her confidence build, let's talk about where we're going and how we're going to get there. She outlined her vision for the Strategic Development Department, a team that would identify emerging market opportunities, develop innovative approaches to client challenges, and position Morrison and Associates as a thought leader in the industry. It was ambitious, but Sarah had learned that ambition was simply preparation meeting opportunity. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah threw herself into her new role with the same dedication she'd brought to her assistant position, but now she was building rather than just supporting. She developed new client acquisition strategies, streamlined project management processes, and implemented innovative approaches to market research. Her team responded enthusiastically to her leadership style, which emphasized collaboration, creative thinking, and professional development. Sarah made sure that each team member had opportunities to contribute their unique strengths and to grow their skills in areas where they wanted to advance. The results were immediate and impressive. Morrison and Associates landed 3 new major accounts in Sarah's first month as director. Client satisfaction scores increased across the board, and employee morale in her department reached all-time highs. Sarah's success began to attract attention throughout the company and the industry. Marketing publications started featuring Morrison and Associates as an innovative firm to watch, and several competitors attempted to recruit Sarah for senior positions. David was delighted with the transformation, both in Sarah and in the company's performance. I should have done this years ago, he told her during one of their weekly strategy meetings. You've changed the entire culture of this place. But the most satisfying moment came on a warm May afternoon, when Sarah was leaving the building after a particularly successful client presentation. She was walking across the lobby, feeling confident and accomplished in her new tailored suit, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Well, look who's playing dress-up in a big girl job. Sarah turned to see Melissa standing near the elevator bank, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her expression a mixture of amusement and disdain. She was carrying several shopping bags from expensive boutiques, and her outfit probably cost more than Sarah's monthly salary, even with her recent promotion. Hello, Melissa, Sarah said calmly. How are you? I'm wonderful, actually. I just came from lunch with David. We had a lovely conversation about his future plans. Melissa's smile was sharp and predatory. He's been under so much stress lately, poor thing. All these new responsibilities, all this pressure to perform. I think he's starting to realize that some people just aren't cut out for expansion. Sarah felt a familiar tightening in her stomach, but this time it wasn't from insecurity. It was from recognition. She could see exactly what Melissa was trying to do. The same thing she'd attempted months earlier, but now directed at David instead of Sarah. That's interesting, Sarah said, her voice pleasant and professional, because from where I sit, David seems more energized and confident than he's been in months. The company is performing better than ever, and he's been talking about opening a second office. Melissa's smile faltered slightly. Well, that's a lovely fantasy, but business is about more than optimism. It's about realistic expectations and knowing your limitations. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. It's also about recognizing opportunity and having the courage to seize it when it presents itself. Oh, honey. Melissa's voice dripped with the same false sympathy Sarah remembered from their first conversation. You really think this little promotion changes anything? You're still the same person you were 6 months ago. You're still just playing a role that's too big for you. Sarah studied Melissa's face, seeing something there that she'd missed before. It wasn't just cruelty or arrogance. It was fear. Melissa was afraid that the people around her might actually be capable of growth and change, because that would mean she'd have to grow and change too. You know what's funny? Sarah said, shifting her leather portfolio to her other arm. 6 months ago, you told me I'd never be more than David's assistant. You were so certain that some people are just meant to serve others, and that I should accept my limitations. And I was right, Melissa said quickly. One promotion doesn't change your fundamental nature. Maybe not, Sarah agreed. But it does prove that people aren't as fixed as you seem to think they are. I've discovered that I'm capable of far more than I ever imagined. It makes me wonder what other assumptions might be worth reconsidering. Melissa's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Well, for instance, I used to assume that someone who spent their time trying to convince others to accept limitations must be someone who had a lot to offer themselves. But now I'm starting to think that maybe people who focus on other people's ceilings are just trying to distract from their own floors. The color drained from Melissa's face. For the first time in their acquaintance, she seemed to be at a loss for words. Anyway, Sarah continued cheerfully, I should run. I have a conference call with a potential client in Singapore in 20 minutes. International expansion, you know. It's exciting to think about how much further we can grow. She turned and walked toward the building exit, leaving Melissa standing alone by the elevators. As she pushed through the revolving doors, Sarah felt a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with her recent successes and everything to do with finally understanding her own worth. The Singapore client signed with Morrison & Associates 2 weeks later, marking the company's first international expansion. David was so pleased that he called an all-hands meeting to announce the news and to publicly recognize Sarah's role in the achievement. When I started this company, he told the assembled staff, I thought success meant doing everything myself, controlling every detail, and never showing weakness. But I've learned that real success means recognizing talent, empowering people to exceed their own expectations, and having the courage to evolve. He paused, his eyes finding Sarah in the crowd. Sarah Mitchell has exemplified that kind of courage. She's grown from an exceptional assistant to an outstanding director to now, our new Vice President of International Development. The applause was thunderous. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from emotion alone but from the sheer amazement of how dramatically her life had changed in such a short time. After the meeting, as colleagues congratulated her and discussed the company's bright future, Sarah found herself thinking about Melissa's words from all those months ago. Some people are just meant to serve others, and there's nothing wrong with that. You should probably just accept it and stop reaching for things that are beyond your grasp. The irony was that Melissa had been partially right. There was nothing wrong with serving others. Sarah's success had come not from abandoning service, but from redefining it. Instead of serving David's immediate needs as an assistant, she was now serving the company's long-term vision as a vice president. Instead of accepting limitations, she'd discovered that her capacity to serve could be expanded infinitely. That evening, Sarah called her sister Emma to share the news. Vice President. Emma shrieked into the phone. Sarah, this is incredible. I'm so proud of you. Thanks, Sarah said, smiling as she looked out at the Chicago skyline from her apartment window. The city lights seemed brighter tonight, full of possibility and promise. You know what's funny? It all started because someone told me I'd never amount to more than an assistant. Best insult ever, apparently, Emma laughed. Are you going to send her a thank you card? Sarah considered this. Actually, in a weird way, I am grateful to her. She forced me to examine assumptions about myself that I'd never questioned. If she hadn't been so determined to put me in a box, I might never have discovered that I didn't belong in one. 6 months later, Morrison and Associates had expanded to Singapore, London, and Toronto. Sarah's international division was generating 40% of the company's revenue, and industry publications were featuring her as one of the top young executives in marketing. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Managing international teams across different time zones required Sarah to develop new skills in cross-cultural communication and remote leadership. She'd spent countless hours learning about international business practices, regulatory requirements, and cultural nuances that could make or break marketing campaigns in different countries. Her office had been expanded again to accommodate her growing responsibilities. The space now included a conference area for video calls with international clients and a wall of monitors displaying real-time performance metrics from all their global campaigns. The view of Chicago remained spectacular, but Sarah found herself looking out at it with a different perspective, not as someone trapped in the city, but as someone using it as a launching pad for worldwide opportunities. She was reviewing quarterly reports from the London office when her assistant knocked on the door. Sarah had hired Maria Rodriguez, a recent business school graduate with ambitions of her own. Sarah made sure that Maria's role included strategic responsibilities and growth opportunities, determined never to limit someone else's potential the way hers had been limited. "Ms. Mitchell, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." Sarah looked up from her computer screen, where she'd been analyzing expansion opportunities in the Australian market. Did she give her name? Melissa Crawford. Sarah felt a familiar tightening in her stomach, but this time it was more curiosity than anxiety. She hadn't seen or heard from Melissa since their encounter in the lobby months earlier. "Send her in." Melissa entered the office looking exactly as polished and put together as ever, but there was something different in her demeanor. The predatory confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. Her designer clothes were still impeccable, her makeup still flawless, but the aura of superiority that had once defined her seemed to have diminished. "Sarah," she said, stopping in front of the desk, "congratulations on your success. I've been reading about the company's expansion in the business journals." "Thank you," Sarah said, gesturing to one of the chairs across from her desk. "Please have a seat. What can I do for you?" Melissa sat carefully, crossing her legs and smoothing her skirt in a gesture that Sarah recognized as playing for time. Her usual supreme confidence seemed to have been replaced by something that looked like genuine nervousness. "I want to talk to you about David." "Oh." Sarah kept her expression neutral, though she was genuinely curious about where this conversation was heading. "He's been different lately, distant. He says he needs to focus on work, that he doesn't have time for the kind of relationship I want." Melissa's voice was quieter than Sarah had ever heard it, almost vulnerable. "I think it's because of the changes here, the success you've brought to the company. He's become someone I don't recognize." Sarah studied Melissa's face, seeing something she'd never seen before: genuine confusion and what might have been the beginning of self-reflection. The woman who had once seemed so certain about everyone else's limitations now appeared to be questioning her own assumptions. "People do change," Sarah said carefully. "Sometimes circumstances force us to discover parts of ourselves we didn't know existed." "Is that what happened to you?" Melissa asked, her blue eyes meeting Sarah's directly for the first time in their acquaintance. "Yes," Sarah said simply, "though I had some help recognizing that change was necessary." The words hung in the air between them, both women understanding the implication. Melissa's cruel assessment had been the catalyst for Sarah's transformation, though probably not in the way Melissa had intended. Melissa was quiet for a long moment, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing the edge of her purse. "I've been thinking about what you said that day in the lobby, about people who focus on other people's ceilings trying to distract from their own floors." Sarah waited, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere important. "The truth is," Melissa continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't think I have any floors at all. I don't think I have anything to build on. I've spent my whole life being decorative, being the kind of woman men want to be seen with. But I've never actually built anything or accomplished anything meaningful." The admission hung in the air between them, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions of vindication, certainly, but also something that might have been compassion. This was the same woman who had tried to crush her spirit. But sitting here now, Melissa seemed more lost than malicious. "It's never too late to start building," Sarah said gently. Melissa laughed, but it was a broken sound. Nothing like the crystal-sharp laugh Sarah remembered. "Easy for you to say. You had skills, intelligence, potential. You just needed the opportunity to show them. I have nothing except my appearance, and that's not going to last forever." "I don't think that's true," Sarah said, surprising herself with her sincerity. "You have excellent taste, strong social skills, and enough confidence to walk into any room and command attention. Those are all valuable assets in the right context." Sarah meant what she said. Despite everything that had happened between them, she could recognize that Melissa possessed qualities that could be channeled productively if she chose to develop them. "You're being kind," Melissa said, shaking her head. "After everything I said to you, everything I tried to do to you, you're being kind. That just makes it worse." "Melissa, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you told me I'd never be more than an assistant, did you actually believe that? Or were you just trying to hurt me?" Melissa was quiet for so long that Sarah thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful in a way Sarah had never heard before. "Both, I think. I did believe it because I believed it about myself. I thought people were either born winners or born losers, and that trying to change your fundamental nature was just setting yourself up for disappointment and humiliation." She paused, looking out at the city skyline. "But I also said it because I was threatened by you." "Threatened by me?" Sarah was genuinely surprised. "Why?" "Because you cared about something beyond yourself. You were passionate about your work, committed to growth and learning. I could see that David respected you in a way that he'd never respected me. I was beautiful and charming and fun, but you were substantial, and I was jealous of that substance." The honesty in Melissa's voice was startling. Sarah had expected many things from this conversation, but not this level of self-awareness and vulnerability. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Melissa admitted. "David and I broke up last week. He said he needed to be with someone who challenged him to grow rather than someone who encouraged him to stay static. He didn't mention you specifically, but I think we both know who he was talking about." Sarah felt a flush of surprise and something that might have been possibility. She and David had developed an excellent working relationship over the past months, and there had been moments when she'd wondered if there might be something more. But she'd been so focused on her career growth that she hadn't allowed herself to explore those feelings. "Are you hoping for a reconciliation?" Sarah asked. "No," Melissa said, and for the first time, her voice carried genuine certainty. "I think I need to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else wants me to be. I've never been alone in my adult life. I went from my parents' house to college boyfriends to serious relationships to David. I don't even know what I like when there's no one else to impress." "That sounds like a good place to start," Sarah said. Melissa stood, shouldering her expensive handbag with a gesture that looked almost like armor being donned. But this time, the armor seemed designed for protection rather than intimidation. "I want to apologize to you, Sarah, not just for the things I said, but for trying to convince you to limit yourself. I was wrong, and I'm glad you didn't listen to me." "Thank you," Sarah said, standing as well. "And Melissa, for what it's worth, I think you're capable of more than you give yourself credit for. The fact that you came here today, that you were honest about your motivations and your fears, that took courage. That's something to build on." Melissa's smile was different this time, smaller, more genuine, less performative. "Maybe you're right. I guess we'll find out." After Melissa left, Sarah returned to her quarterly reports, but her mind was spinning with the implications of their conversation. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from assistant to director to vice president, from someone who accepted limitations to someone who challenged them at every turn. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Dinner tonight? I have something I want to discuss with you." Sarah smiled as she typed her response. "Absolutely. 7 o'clock. Perfect. And Sarah, thank you for everything you've done for this company." I know I don't say it enough, but you've changed my life in ways I'm still discovering. As Sarah prepared to leave the office that evening, she looked around her space, the awards on the wall, the international client photos, the strategic planning boards covered with her handwriting and vision for the future. None of this had existed a year ago. None of this had even seemed possible. She thought about Melissa's words from that first conversation. Some people are just meant to serve others, and there's nothing wrong with that. You should probably just accept it and stop reaching for things that are beyond your grasp. The truth was, Sarah had discovered that she was meant to serve others, but on her own terms, in her own way, with her own vision of what service could accomplish. She'd learned that there was nothing beyond her grasp as long as she was willing to reach for it with determination, intelligence, and the courage to prove wrong anyone who told her otherwise. The restaurant David had chosen was elegant but not ostentatious, the kind of place where serious conversations happened over excellent food. Sarah arrived to find him already seated at a corner table, looking more relaxed and confident than she'd seen him in months. "You look beautiful," he said as she approached, and there was something in his tone that suggested this was more than professional courtesy. "Thank you," Sarah replied, settling into her chair. The nervousness she felt wasn't about business. It was about the possibility that this dinner might represent another kind of transformation entirely. They talked about work initially, discussing the Australian expansion and the potential for entering the South American market. But as the evening progressed, the conversation became more personal, more intimate. "I owe you an enormous debt," David said as they shared dessert. "Not just for saving the company, but for helping me rediscover who I am and who I want to be." "I think we helped each other," Sarah replied. "You gave me the opportunity to grow, even when neither of us realized that's what was happening." "Sarah," David said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I know this complicates things, and I know we need to be careful about how we handle it professionally. But I'd like to explore what's been developing between us." Sarah felt her heart race, but this time it was with excitement rather than anxiety. "I'd like that too." The relationship that developed between Sarah and David was built on mutual respect, shared vision, and genuine partnership. They were careful to maintain professional boundaries at work, but their personal connection added a new dimension to their already successful collaboration. A year later, Morrison & Associates had become one of the most respected marketing firms in North America, with successful operations on 4 continents. Sarah's title had evolved to Chief Operating Officer, and she was being courted by headhunters from some of the largest corporations in the world. But more than professional success, Sarah had discovered something far more valuable: the knowledge that she was capable of defining her own worth and creating her own opportunities. She'd learned that limitations were often just assumptions waiting to be challenged, and that the most powerful transformation was the one that happened when you stopped asking for permission to become who you were meant to be. On a crisp autumn morning, almost exactly 2 years after Melissa's initial crushing assessment, Sarah stood in her office looking out at the Chicago skyline. Her reflection in the window showed a woman transformed, confident, accomplished, and completely comfortable with her own power. Her assistant, Maria, had recently been promoted to Director of Emerging Markets, continuing Sarah's commitment to nurturing talent rather than limiting it. The cycle of growth and opportunity that Sarah had fought so hard to enter was now something she was actively creating for others. She thought about calling Melissa, who had surprised everyone by enrolling in a graduate program in nonprofit management and was reportedly thriving in her studies. But then she decided that some transformations were meant to be private journeys, honored from a distance rather than celebrated directly. Instead, Sarah turned back to her desk, where plans for the company's European expansion waited for her review. There was still so much to build, so many opportunities to seize, so many assumptions to challenge. Outside, the city hummed with the energy of millions of people pursuing their own dreams and ambitions. Sarah Mitchell, Chief Operating Officer, felt grateful to be among them, not as someone who had finally found her place, but as someone who had learned to create her own place wherever she chose to stand.